excited to introduce to you Dr. Sarah Benson. Is from Birmingham University on Dubai campus, and she'll be doing the Ask the Expert slot. In a second, I'll give you a bit of a background information about Dr. Sarah Benson, but that should be a really interesting insight there. And then we'll break for lunch from 1 till 1:30. And then after we come back from the lunch break, we'll be doing the last part of the session in the afternoon, which is, again, this is where we'll break out and see English and Welsh medium. But this will look at the key challenges to supporting learners with ALN, so teacher expectancy, labelling and accountability. You'll be looking into what does current ALN practice look like, reflections of tool in inclusive classroom practice, and then we'll have a very short break, just for 5 minutes, just to digest really the day. And at the very end of the day, we'll be providing you at about 3:05, we'll do a bit of a recap and reflection, where we'll kind of reflect upon what we've learned today, what we've looked at, with the rich discussions that you've had, and we'll draw it to a close at the end of the day. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background of what to expect today when Dr. Sarah Benson joins us for the Ask the Expert slot, which is really going to be a very useful insight really here into helping you with your module as well. So just to give you a bit of background information on Dr. Sarah Benson. So she's an Associate Professor of Inclusion and Disabilities in the Department of Disability, Inclusion and Special Needs. She is the Programme Lead for the Inclusion and Special Education Needs PG Cert and Masters in the UK and in Dubai. Dr. Benson has published articles and book chapters on inclusive policy in the Middle East. Her interests lie in inclusive policy, new teacher development, and creating opportunities for students with disabilities in post-secondary environments. She has spent time writing, researching inclusive science curricula for primary grade students. And then her current research interests lie in the Middle East and Gulf, where she is inspired to see her rapid growth opportunities for more inclusive communities. In addition, she works closely with the developing action research community to support teachers in creating change in their schools. So that should be a really rich insight from Dr. Sarah Benson later on during the day. Okay, so just to provide you with a bit of an overview of what to expect for the Ask the Expert session today. So what I'm going to do this morning is give you a little bit of a brief overview of the assessment. I know you've probably already started to look at this in a little bit more detail, and obviously the previous national conference day, that will also lend itself well to starting to think about some elements of this, especially when we're thinking about inclusive practice and those really rich conversations that you had in the first national conference day. So what you need to do ultimately for this assessment is that you need to create strategies to support inclusive classroom practice, and it's a reflection of your own effectiveness in the classroom, of the effectiveness in your own classroom of how these strategies are implemented. Now, what we do say normally is that you look at maybe no more than 3 strategies for this, so approximately 2 to 3 strategies. And this is mainly because you will find as you start doing this that in order to get that really rich, deep depth and criticality that's required for the assessment, that you will need to make sure really that you're not having maybe 3 if you feel that you can't sort of fulfill that element of the assessment. So we have provided you with a bit of a structure for how to go about creating this assessment. Ultimately, it is in 2 separate parts almost. You've got your 500 bit at the beginning where you kind of identify the strategies, and you've got the more reflective element, which is your 3,500 word response to those strategies. So remember when you come to writing your assessment to really utilise obviously the previous national conference information, all the information that's on the Pebble pad, you know, the literature, the readings that are available, and really use that as well to kind of help, you know, stem these ideas and what you want to write about for the context of this assessment. So what we're asking you to do is to identify and discuss up to 3 strategies that you have implemented in teaching to support inclusive practice. So you're thinking about your own, so it's in the context of your own setting, and then what you're doing is you're critically engaging them with the current debates around inclusion. So for this 500 part here, you're basically providing that opening to what they are and thinking about within here some of these questions that we've stated within the assessment guidance. So thinking about how this connects with current legislation and policy, thinking about does it challenge current practice? And the last one is it necessary? So what you're doing is you're really engaging with these strategies and you're thinking about how it looks in relation to current sort of legislation that you have, what sort of policy that we're abiding by for these. But also a big part of this is does it challenge what's going on in the setting? So approximately 500 words you need for that, and it's really useful to use this structure to ensure that you're fulfilling all elements of the assessment requirements. Remember, it is in the context of your own setting, this is. So what you'll need to do is it'll be very varied across the board really, because it depends on your own setting where you are. So some of you might be in additional learning needs setting, some of you might be in a mainstream primary school, some of you might work in further education. So it might be slightly different in how this looks in your context, but it needs to be in the context of your own workplace. So the second part of this assessment is where you delve a lot deeper really into the criticality using a reflective theory. So as you see on the Pebble Pad, we've given you some examples of reflective theory that you can use. And I'll go into this in a minute, a little bit later on in this morning's introduction. But what you need to do is use either Gibbs, Kolb, or you can use another reflective theory that you might find be more suitable for your reflection. And if you do find another reflective theory you'd like to use, and then feel free to maybe have these discussions in your drop-ins with your HEI as well to see if it's suitable and how it might kind of marry up to your strategies and your reflection. But what you need to do is use an identified reflective theory, and then you need to structure your response drawing upon literature to support your discussion. So it's really important here that you've got that background reading, that literature, that naturally as well will really help that depth that you'll need for this reflection. And then what you need to do is you need to discuss strategies that you've used to support inclusion, and then think about these questions that we've put to you here within the assessment criteria. So thinking about identifying and describing the strategies to support inclusive classroom practice, what challenges were faced in implementing the strategies? So what sort of challenges in the context of your own setting are there? It could be, here looking at exploring the application of the identified strategies in a wider context. And I know this is something that you've already seen probably within like the Pebble Pad and in the last national conference, that you are thinking quite broadly about inclusive practice. And how obviously that also looks then, for example, in working collaboratively with others. And lastly, as well, think about things like how you can challenge current practice. And it's really good to think about then how this could potentially influence change moving forward. Think about what you're reading in the literature as well. What have you read? That criticality of what might work best. Then again, thinking about the fact that you're coming at this from a different lens almost as well, and the fact that you are seeing that there maybe is, pros and cons almost, isn't there, to some of the strategies that we put in place. And we think about inclusive practice in itself, there are lots of kind of varied sort of ideas that you can look at within there, thinking about the last national conference and the Pebble Pad readings as well. Okay. So yeah, I've just pulled together some sort of like key points really this morning, just to think about when you're writing this assessment. So just some things to remember when you're creating your assessment. Is the first thing is because it's in the context of your own setting, it is really, really important. It is completely paramount that you are making sure you remain confidential. Okay, so confidentiality is so important because although you're talking in the context of your own setting, you need to ensure that we cannot identify that setting from reading this assessment. Okay, so by doing this, making sure that you're not using any names of schools. And it's absolutely fine to put, school X, or if you're in a college X, or, however you want to code your setting. And it's also really important to remember that when you're using this code to make sure that you aren't identifying your setting, if you do refer to, say, a policy or a piece of legislation in your setting, that you are also reflecting that within your reference as well. So just making sure that you aren't putting the name of the setting within that reference. It's also just important really to make sure that, if you are, talking about a head teacher, using the word head teacher rather than, head teacher of school X rather than Mrs. Jones, say, of school X even, just making sure that we really do ensure that there is no way that this information could be identified, could identify your school setting or the staff that work within the setting. It's also just really a big reminder, really, to make sure that you remain focused on the assessment requirements. We've provided you there with quite a sort of a specific structure, really, to follow. And just what I'd say to you is make sure you're reviewing that structure and making sure that you are remaining focused on it. As this really does help ensure that you are meeting all the assessment requirements for your assessment. In order to satisfy all those elements, it's just really important that we don't kind of go off on a tangent or maybe lose focus on what is actually required within those learning outcomes. That's why it's really important as well, and I'll go through with you in a minute, but it's really important to utilise the rubrics as well, as that's really useful to give you an idea, what we're marking you against as it comes to my next point. Utilising that marking criteria to check that you are fulfilling all elements there, and it shows you kind of this marking system that we use as well. It also kind of ensures really, if you make sure you're using the marking criteria, that you kind of understand a bit of a level really on kind of what the requirements are. Also references, really, really important that you're engaging with sources and that you are making sure you present them accurately. Please just ensure that you are supporting any information that you're putting forward and that you're putting them in the right, that you're constructing them right. It ensures accuracy more than anything as well, that we know exactly what sources you've utilised. And it also, by using lots of different literature sources and you're using these references, it naturally helps enhance that depth, that criticality. So you do need that strong background reading to make sure you have that level of criticality that's needed really, and it supports those arguments. If you're talking about strategies that you're putting in place in your setting, you need to really support that in-depth discussion around sort of, how that looks in terms of inclusive practice using the literature. And as my next point says here, that it's just really important to make sure that the literature that you're using is suitable. Obviously, just being careful that you are using proper, as we say, peer-reviewed, published articles really most of the time. Although there might be now and again, some policy or legislation that you are referring to, but overall, you just need to make sure that it's reliable. Be really careful because out there are some not very accurate, articles, websites. Be really careful of using anything that's, any kind of blog, Wikipedias, things like that. Just please make sure you steer away from anything that isn't going to be reliable for your assessment. And also, just to remind you, and I think it's really useful, is to remember that there are those examples on the Pebble Pad. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen them already, but it's just really useful to refer to those as giving you a bit of an idea. Obviously, it's completely about your own context, this assessment, but it just might give you an idea of kind of some of the requirements and the levelling amongst that as well for this assessment from previous years. Okay, so just to remind you as well with the marking criteria, now all this is available on the Pebble Pad, but just to remind you that when it comes to your marking criteria, it also states how you're meeting the learning outcomes. You can see here that between the different parts that we're marking you against within the marking criteria, there is also this element of learning outcomes that match. And also, as you can see, there is a weighting that goes forward for these. So as you can see for the first one, it's a 20% weighting, the next one 15%. So that percentage of the overall grade will come from these weighting and then they're linked to the learning outcomes. It's also important to remind you at the very bottom there that we do have these 5% weighting for your referencing. So it's just a reminder really that it is really important that you are making sure that you're referencing accurately and that you're utilising sources throughout your piece of work as well. This also might help you kind of understand how the structure works. So in relation to the learning outcomes and then how our marking criteria links to those learning outcomes when you're developing it as well. So here gives you just a kind of a screenshot here of kind of how it looks in relation to the, the marking criteria, and then how we level you. So for instance, you do have this pass merit distinction grade, and you do need that 50% grade to pass your assessment on the National Masters. But here, and this is also, like I said, it's all available on there, but just remember it shows you an idea of the point system that we use. So this is how we mark your work. So if you have a little look through this, it will really help you gauge an idea of leveling, kind of what you want to be thinking about for your assessment, and the depth that you'll need to provide if you want to try and hit that very top kind of, distinction level piece of work as well. So just to remind you as well, so as I mentioned before, that part of this assessment, that 3,500 words, this really does require you to utilize one of the reflective models that you choose to use. So obviously here, for example, which is on the Pebble Pad, you have the Gibbs reflective cycle that you could utilize. Now, what you need to be doing here really is utilizing those questions I went through before, identifying, describing the strategies, how you've used them, but using the cycle that you choose, whichever reflective theory you want to look at, but you're using it as a platform to structure it. So rather than you just writing a reflection from obviously, how you might see it, you're using it as a form of structure to make sure that you're providing that foundation to each sort of part of your reflection. Um, if you think that you're not going to use, one of the ones that we've provided you with on the Pebble Pad, for instance, Gibbs or Kolb or whatever, just make sure maybe you have that discussion with your HEI just to check that it will be suitable and it will help support that depth really that's required for this part of the assessment as well. Okay, so obviously this is how it looks. This is your marking rubrics. I would just say as well, refer to it and also remember to utilize all the information that's on there from the Pebble Pad as well. But there's lots and lots of things on there to utilize. But this here, like I said before, it will really help you gauge kind of the point scoring system. If you notice, it's different for each criteria. So just have a little look through. It's just definitely worth referring to this as you're writing your assessment, or even before, just to kind of check kind of that you are, ensuring that you meet the level that you're hoping to achieve for this assessment. So like I've just put a screenshot here just to remind you as well, like I mentioned before, they are there, utilize them. There's some great examples on there to have a little look at. And we've given you a variety of grades as well, which hopefully will be useful in, again, helping you kind of gauge that level and that requirement from the assessment, and what links to the marking criteria that I went through them with you. Okay, so any questions? Now, if you want to, please feel free to pop your questions in the chat throughout the day, anything that you want to ask. But please, just throughout the day, utilize that. But has anyone got any questions before I pass you over to Meg for the first session today? I'll just stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone.